I stumbled back down the steps. Half of my body's blood supply spilled across the house. My grandmother's corpse still laid near the front door, her death long awaited. I limped past her, blood dripping off the sole of my shoe as I stepped in the pool. I reached for the door with a heavy hand, trying to at least get outside before I fainted from my injuries. My vision slowly grew fuzzy as I stumbled forward, grabbing the doorknob to keep myself up. The knife clanked against the floor as it slipped from my weak grip, my arm resting by my side. I sat on my knees, resting my head against the door as I took deep, slow breaths. I couldn't give up now. I did too much to get where I was. I gripped the knob tightly, groaning as I lifted myself up. I slowly creaked the door open, my eyelids impulsively squeezing shut as the bright sunlight beamed. I slid out the door, the cool air satisfying to breathe. I lifted my head, closing my eyes and taking savory breaths. I hadn't gotten the chance to just breathe. I quickly collapsed to my knees, pressing my blood-soaked palms against the concrete pathway. My jaw trembled as tears welled in my eyes. It felt like everything had just hit me. I killed everyone. I killed my entire family. The thought forced tears out of my eyes. It was a fight for survival, but at what cost? I let myself sob. I deserved to feel something else other than anger. When I emptied the sadness from my body, I wiped off my damp cheeks, weakly getting on my feet. I sniffled as I looked around my gated community. Nobody was outside, but I needed help. I staggered off my front porch and into the street. I went for the first house that was directly across mine. The car was in their driveway. I almost tripped up the smooth stone steps as I approached the big metal doors. With all my strength, I pounded against it. "Please, help me," I pleaded. My simple cries felt over-exaggerating. But there was no response. I banged again, my arms ready to drop. "Please, I'm injured badly," I cried, breathing heavily. Suddenly, the sound of clicking heels came tapping towards the door. My eyes widened with hope, until the door wasn't open. I eyed the side of the house, catching the resident peeking through their pulled-back curtains. She didn't look worried or panicked. She looked disgusted. I stared back in silence, a beg for help gleaming in my eye. She threw the curtains back, her footsteps leading towards the door. She inched the door open, just enough to fit her head through. "I don't know what dumpster you dragged yourself out of, but get off my property before I call security. How'd you even get in here?" she warned. I'm literally I tried to explain, but she slammed the door shut. I stood in shock. Did she not recognize me? With a dropped jaw, I stumbled off her front porch and tried another house, and another house, and another house. Each ignored my life pleas, told me to fuck off, or weren't even home. After my last attempt, I gave up, standing aimlessly in the street like a lost dog. If nobody was going to help me, I needed to help myself. I made my way back to that wretched house, hoping it was my last time. I sighed as I threw the door open, seeing my grandmother's corpse once again. I wished she'd just vanish, like a dead enemy in a video game. I limped up the stairs again, back into the blood-painted hallway. The bodies were still spread across the ground, the blood drying into the fabric of the carpet. I needed to find a phone, which is actually harder than you'd think. My great-grandmother owned the house, so all rules were written by her. She felt that house phones would allow spirits of the house to speak to us, so we never had those. I wasn't allowed my own cell phone because I could get one when I was able to pay for my own, so that made this even harder. I had to take the bet that one of my family members had their phones on them. I started with my parents' corpses. They laid close to each other. My father's brain matter dried to the carpet. I kneeled down, almost losing my balance, and began pilfering through every pocket. Nothing. Even in death, he was fucking useless. I turned to my mother's corpse, pausing for a moment. I couldn't avert my gaze from her decimated face. The sight churned my stomach. She deserved better. I held back tears as I searched through her pockets, ending up with nothing. I stood up, making my way towards my aunt and uncle. After checking my uncle's corpse, I was left with my aunt. I stepped over her corpse, approaching the mess that I left my aunt in. I carefully danced around the shards of glass that scattered across the ground. I reached down, sliding my hand into her pocket. My eyes shot open as my finger grazed the corner of a phone. I quickly grasped it, trying to slide it out of her tight jeans. Suddenly, my legs gave out. I groaned and I dropped to the ground, grabbing the frame of the table to keep myself up. I wasn't getting any stronger. I needed to act fast. I lifted myself back up, my arm shaking. I used my other hand to pull the phone out, and then stumbled out of the room. I dabbled my fingers against my shoulder wound, baring my teeth as it stung. Blood covered my fingertips. I was still bleeding badly. I wiped them off against my pants and kept walking. I walked down those steps for the last time, feeling as hard as ever to do so. I stepped outside, looking behind me as I closed the door. I lifted the phone, praying it wasn't dead. I sighed with relief and a smile as it turned on. Thank God old people don't put passwords on their phones either. I opened the phone app and dialed 911. I raised the phone to my ear, tapping my teeth together as it rang.
911 operator, what's your emergency?
A woman on the other end asked. I have a medical emergency. I have multiple injuries, I explained.
What is your address?
She went on. I told her my address, explaining that I'm in a gated community.
An ambulance is on their way,
she informed me. Okay, thank you. I sat down on my curb, feeling dizzy. She asked me a few more questions about my injuries and what happened. It was hard explaining that my entire family tried to murder me and feast on my corpse. I eventually hung up the call, waiting for the ambulance to arrive. I looked around my street with tired eyes. It was so dull you'd think it was abandoned. All the trimmed bushes and parked Cadillacs don't cover the fact that everyone hated each other and thought they were better than everyone. After a few minutes, the sound of sirens broke me out of my thought cloud. The ambulance pulled up in front of my house, the colored lights spinning. I stood up and two men hopped up. Thank you. My words trailed off as I suddenly felt numb. I collapsed to the ground, my vision blurry and my head muffled. She's losing a lot of blood, one of the men exclaimed in panic, motioning for the other to get a stretcher. They pulled it out of the back of the ambulance, lifting me onto it. My eyes slid around, my eyelids desperately wanting to close. I looked at the blue sky and the faces of the panicked men carrying me. It was hard for me to make out what they looked like. Everything was fuzzy. They lifted me into the ambulance, a woman sitting on the back with me. She lifted my head, strapping a mask to my face, and began pumping something into my lungs. Within seconds, I felt exhausted. My vision blurred even further, everything in a mist. But before I blacked out, it's funny. I looked at the woman and I could have sworn she had 3 eyes. I slowly opened my eyes, staring at a blurring ceiling. I was laying down comfortably, my back supported by a soft bed. I reached up to rub my eyes, quickly feeling the weight of tubes that ran into my arms. I wiped the fuzziness from my vision, blinking rapidly. I made it to the hospital without dying. I looked over at the heart rate monitor as it beeped, mesmerized by the green bar as it rose and dropped to my heartbeat. There were wrinkled green curtains that separated the beds for privacy. Nurses fast walked by, masks covering their mouths. I reached up to touch the bandage on my forehead, flinching as it stung. "Oh, you're awake," a nurse suddenly exclaimed as she noticed me. She walked over, a clipboard in hand. "How are you feeling?" she asked. Like shit," I chuckled weakly, wheezing as I coughed. "That's the usual with injuries like these," she said, leaning down towards me. "How long was I out for?" I questioned. "A short 3 hours, I think," she answered, jotting something down. "I'm gonna change your bandages. This might sting a bit," she warned me. She gripped the gauze, my eyes shooting open as she applied unexpected pressure. I held in cries as she pressed into my wound, vigorously ripping off the bandage. I couldn't tell if she was extremely inexperienced or she did it on purpose. She dangled the crimson-soaked cloth, then dropped it into her pocket. She pulled out a clean gauze and medical tape. I almost shot up out of bed and she pushed the gauze against my wound, practically shoving her finger into it. "Please, less pressure," I pleaded. "Sorry, honey, it'll be just a moment." She ignored my request. She taped it down, my shoulder throbbing as she ran her finger over to make it stick. I squeezed my eyes, a tear running down my cheek. "Oh, I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to be so rough," she apologized, her tone ditzy. She grated her thumb across my cheek, wiping away my tear. With a smile, she began walking away. I stared at her in confusion and a bit of shock. Why did she manhandle me? Then I caught something strange. As she turned the corner, almost behind the curtain, she put her thumb in her mouth and licked it clean. Did she just eat my tears? I thought to myself, absolutely baffled. I uncomfortably shifted around in my bed, my shoulder raging with pain again. I stayed observant like a hawk for a few hours, the nurse never returning since. In my time, I noticed a few things. First of all, the place seemed extremely understaffed. I think the only nurse I saw walk back and forth was the one that practically abused me. And a man walked by a few times, seemingly a doctor, but that was it. The only people that worked on this floor. Speaking of floors, I never saw anyone leave this one. From my viewpoint, the hospital seemed to be in a T shape. The rows of beds were at the top, and then one long hallway that leads to other rooms, then the staircase and elevators. My bed resided in front of that hallway, giving me a bird's eye view. I had not seen one person enter or exit the staircase, neither the elevator. And I thought I was overreacting. I lost a lot of blood, so I didn't exactly possess clarity, but I came from a family of psychotic cannibals. I could smell suspiciousness, like a drop of blood in a bottomless ocean. The one thing that stayed under my skin was the nurse. A medical professional could not be that reckless. She was like a caricature. My tears, she licked it off her finger. Everything just felt so strange, like I was on an episode of The Twilight Zone. I knew I sounded paranoid, nitpicking with these observations till I was visited by the nurse. It was around 7 p.m., the sun almost set. She smiled as she appeared around the curtain, holding an IV bag. I faked a smile. "We meet again," she joked. I nodded, letting out a stale chuckle. "I'm going to change your IV for the night," she explained, unhooking the old bag. She then reached for my arm, giving me a moment before she pulled the needle out. "This might hurt a bit. It's okay to scream or cry," she tried to reassure me. I'll be fine," I croaked, her comment rubbing me the wrong way. She unwrapped the tape, gripping the needles that were buried in my arm. Suddenly, she tore them out of my arm. A scream escaped my mouth as I almost flew off the bed. I looked down at my arm with wide eyes, blood squirting out of the holes. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she apologized, reaching in her pocket for gauze pads. I glared at her like she was insane. My jaw dropped. She ignored my gaze and pressed the pads against my wound. The white cloth quickly ran red as my gushing blood soaked into it. While holding it down, she used her other hand to pull out tape, tearing off a piece and using it to keep the gauze down. "That should stop the bleeding eventually." She straightened her back. I continued to stare at her in shock. I couldn't believe what she had just done. She pulled the needle out like a plug from an outlet. She was about to walk away until she turned to me. She stared at me intensely, like she was studying my face. Her expression showed that a thought ran through her head. "You're a tough cookie, aren't you?" She smirked, sounding scornful. I kept silent, continuing to stare. She eventually walked away, my eyes following her until she disappeared. I looked down at my arm, groaning as I bent it. It wasn't the worst of my injuries, but it felt like a really intense bruise. I didn't know where I was going to go, but I needed to get the fuck out of there. I waited until the lights turned off and the floor was clear. When the time was right, I slowly slid off the bed. Goosebumps ran across my skin as my bare feet touched the cold, polished floors. I peered past the curtains, not having seen past them. I looked left and right, perking up like a dog as I noticed a beaming red exit sign. I stepped out from behind the curtain, tiptoeing towards the exit. I would just go through the door, fly down the steps, and escape to somewhere. As I continued down the pathway, I looked over, slowly stopping. The beds were empty. I backtracked a bit, realizing that every bed was empty. Where are the other patients? I shook it off and continued on towards the exit. When I reached the door, I pressed my hands on the cold metal bar, praying an alarm wouldn't go off. I clenched my fist as I pushed into it, preparing to run for my life, until the door didn't open. I scrunched my eyebrows as I repeatedly pushed it, in realization that it was locked. Why would they lock an emergency exit? I thought, fear beginning to grow inside of me. I turned back again, finding myself at square one. My only other options were the staircase or the elevator. I wrapped my hands around the corner, peeking my head out. It was clear, so I slid around and went for it. Suddenly, a muffled conversation caught my ear. I stopped in my tracks, trying to locate the source of the sound. I noticed two silhouettes through the curtain of a room window. I stayed quiet and froze as I listened in. "Are you trying to make it obvious?" a man berated. I'm sorry. You asked for tears or screams. I did my best." A woman apologized. "One fucking tear that you saved for yourself. Humans aren't dumb. We can't have another escapee. We can't afford another cover-up. Get your shit together," he hissed through his teeth. Humans. Odd word choice. "Look, we could just move her to the basement early. I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to make her suspicious," she suggested. "The basement? You want to move her early? Do it yourself. You're the one who wanted to deal with her anyway. Go fucking prove yourself or something," he demanded, his footsteps storming off. I didn't know the context of this conversation, and I didn't want to. It just gave me more of a reason to get out as soon as possible. I crouch-walked towards the elevator, pressing the button. I sat impatiently as I waited for it to arrive at my floor. After sitting there for a few seconds, it seemed like I was on a higher floor than I realized. Suddenly, clicking heels walked towards the door. My neck twisted around, eyeing the door to the room. The elevator wasn't coming any faster, and I couldn't take chances. I quietly sprinted back down the hall, clenching my teeth as I heard the elevator doors open. How convenient. I turned the corner, pressed my back against the wall. I could hear the door suddenly open. The nurse stepped out. I cautiously peered around the corner, attempting to see her position. She stood, staring at the open elevator, a needle in hand. I swiftly retracted my head as she looked down the hall, a look of suspicion in her eye. She began walking down the hall towards my empty bed. I sidestepped farther across the wall, praying she wouldn't see me. She walked through the doorway, stopping my breath for a moment so I did not alert her. She approached my bed, raising the needle as she slowly lifted the blanket. I lightly jolted as she realized I wasn't there, throwing the blanket back down in frustration. "Little bitch," she scoffed under her breath. "She's going to start looking for me. I needed a plan, fast. There was a high chance she'd end up seeing me anyways, so I'd have to trust my legs to carry me to freedom." I slowly went for the elevator. My sight locked on her as she threw curtains out of the way, desperately searching for me. As I turned the corner, she whipped around. Both of our eyes widened as our gazes crossed. We froze for a moment, as if she was scared as well. In the mere seconds of the pause, I realized I wasn't going to make it to the elevator. I then realized I was going to enter another fight for my life. I broke into a sprint, bolting past her. She unfroze, running right on my tail. As I ran, I realized the hall was short, so I was either going to have to dodge her extensively or kill her. The decision was quickly made for me as she leapt onto my back. Unable to handle the weight, I tumbled into a metal cabinet, crashing into the floor. I groaned in pain as we wrestled on the floor. She raised her arm, trying to inject me with the needle. I blocked it as she swung down, my arm shaking as I held back her force. She gripped her other hand around my arm, pinning it to the ground. We were in a face-to-face struggle, her hot breath hitting me. Her skin was beating red, her mouth stretched open to reveal inhumanly jagged teeth. I wriggled the arm she held down, attempting to release her grip. "Just fucking sleep," she growled, forcing the needle towards me. Groans tried to escape through my teeth as the needle almost grazed my skin. I tugged at my arm with all my might, lifting it off the ground with her grip still attached. I directed her arm towards my mouth, quickly sinking my teeth into her skin. She craned her head back, her screams of agony growing stronger as I bit harder. She dropped the needle, using her other arm to pull herself from my grip. As blood began pooling in my mouth, I realized. She gripped her arm, staring at the wound as she whimpered. Blood oozed out of the tooth-sized holes, dripping down her arm. While she was distracted, I snatched the needle and swiftly pierced it into her eyeball. She stumbled backwards, breathlessly crying. The needle was stuck in deep, moving around with her eyeball. She lifted her trembling arm, gripping the needle. She moaned in pain as she slowly removed it, blood trailing down her cheek. After removing it entirely, she dropped it to the ground, her bitten arm dangling at her side. She looked at me, her eyeball red. She wiped away the streak of blood, baring her teeth. She stormed towards me, ready to kill me with her bare hands. I scrambled across the ground, trying to get back on my feet. As I crawled, my hand pressed against cold metal. I looked down, noticing a scalpel under my palm. I gripped it tightly, whipping around with a slash. I hit a bullseye, slicing across her hand as she reached for me. She yelped as she retracted her hand, blood dripping onto the floor. I stumbled till I stood, planting my feet into the ground. I raised the scalpel at her, my hand shaking. Our eyes met, daggers in her gaze, but a sharper one in my hand. She wagged her hand, shaking the blood off as she came after me. She swung at my hand in an attempt to disarm me. I leaned backwards, pressing my arms against my chest to keep them out of her distance. Open for an attack, I lunged towards her, pulling the scalpel into her neck. Her eyes shot open as the blade hit a weak spot. Blood exploded out like a geyser within seconds of pulling out the blade. She tried to keep her balance, blood leaking between her fingers as she tried to plug the hole with her palm. Within seconds, she collapsed to the ground. I dropped the scalpel, my lungs on fire. Suddenly, as I watched the blood pool around her corpse, she began to change. Her skin darkened to a deep red. Her hair disintegrated. Her jaw lowered as it made room to fit long, razor-sharp teeth. I scanned her corpse up and down in confusion. It had made a full transformation. "Oh, what the fuck are you?" I whispered to myself, my eyebrows scrunched. I tiptoed around her corpse, unable to take my eyes off of it. I reached the elevator again, pressing the button. I looked over at the door, remembering that the doctor, or whatever he is, was still there. My teeth chattered as I waited anxiously, staring at the glowing button. I periodically looked behind me, waiting for him to burst out the door. My anxieties cooled down as the elevator beeped, the doors sliding open. I stepped in, pressing the first floor button. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a door opening. I looked up, noticing the doctor staring right back at me. My eyes shot open as I began to press the closed door button. "Stop," he demanded, running towards me as the doors began to close. Close, close, fucking close, I begged as I rapidly pressed the button. I clenched my limbs as he just failed to reach me, his fists slamming against the closed doors. I breathed deeply, a pit in my stomach. I felt barely safe for a moment as I traveled between floors, until it came to a halted stop. I looked up at the floor number. I had stopped at the second. Close enough. I waited until the elevator doors opened. My guard raised up again as the opening doors revealed a concerning scene. I slowly stepped out under flickering lights, blood streaks running across the floor. I tilted my head, eyeing down the hall. Papers were scattered around, bedpans and other equipment scattered about. It felt like I walked into the aftermath of something. I stepped back into the elevator, pressing the floor button a few times. It screeched as it tried to move, but ultimately stayed stuck. I remembered the staircase next to it. I gripped the door handle, grunting as I tugged on it. I groaned in frustration. It was locked. Fuck, I muttered under my breath, stepping back into the hallway. I had to find another staircase. Before I continued down the hall, I caught something out of the corner of my eye. A fire axe sat in a glass container on the wall. I slid my arm into my shirt and elbowed the glass. It shattered easily, almost thin as paper. I reached past the shards, lifting the axe off its stand. I felt its weight in my hand, gripping it with my other one as well. I didn't know if I'd need it, but it wouldn't hurt to have it on me. I prowled down the hall, my feet sticking to dried blood. Broken lights hung down from the ceiling as the others flickered. More blood painted across the floors and walls. There had to have been a full-on massacre. When I reached the end of the hall, I peered around both corners. More empty beds lined the wall, a few of the blankets stained with blood. I hid behind the wall as I noticed something at the end of the hallway. A man was leaning over behind a curtain, grabbing something. He straightened his back, revealing a body in his hands. The person was injured, but they didn't appear to be dead. I flipped my back against the wall as he began walking towards me. I lifted the axe, gripping the handle tightly with both hands. I kept my ears open for the sound of his footsteps, the floor vibrating as he grew closer. When I felt he was close enough, I appeared from behind the corner, throwing my whole body into the swing of my axe. My eyes darted around in confusion as the blade hit the wall. The man had vanished. Suddenly, a chill crawled up my spine as fingers slowly wrapped around my shoulder. I whipped around with a swing, feeling like I was going insane as there was nobody standing in front of me.
Where do you think you're going?
A gravelly voice whispered in my ear. I spun around, swinging the axe throughout the air. I felt taps on my shoulders as he laughed sinisterly, making me twist and turn. I couldn't tell if he was extremely fast or just invisible. I then felt something slice across my arm. I yelped in pain as I looked down, blood seeping into one of those jagged slashes that ran across my skin. I swiftly bent my neck as I felt a stream of air fly by my ear. I swung my axe around again, still not getting a hit. I quickly pressed my hand against my cheeks as he attacked my face. I removed my hand, blood trailing through the crevices of my palm. I made one last attempt at an attack. I pressed the bottom of the handle against my stomach. The blade extended outwards. I began spinning in a circle, covering any ground that he could have been on. I stopped shortly as my lungs began to singe with exhaustion. Where the fuck could he be? Then it clicked. I slowly looked up. My eyes widened at the sight of the man latched to the ceiling. His skin was pale, his long nails hooked into the panels. His body was facing the ceiling, his skin on his neck straining as he had twisted around to stare at me. Before I could make a move, he retracted his claws and dropped above me. I screamed as the weight of his body crashed me to the ground, the axe slipping from my grip and sliding across the floor. I groaned as I held his arms back, his claws desperately trying to reach me. I stared deeply into his eyes, his iris a dark red. I slid my hands up to his arms until I could easily grab his claws. I clumped them together into my grip, bending them backwards. He hissed in pain as I pushed farther until they snapped in half. He leapt off of me, pressing his arms against his chest like a T-Rex. I scrambled to my feet, rushing over to grab the axe. I stood steadily, staring him down with the axe raised. He stared back, stretching out his fingers with now destroyed claws. And then, as I closed my eyes to blink, he vanished as I reopened them. I looked up at the ceiling, and he hadn't gone there either. "Come on," I groaned in frustration. I realized he had somehow snuck behind me as his arm wrapped around my neck. My eyes shot open as he applied enough pressure to cut off my airways. I attempted to reach behind me, trying to snatch him or gouge his eye, but he used his other hand to hold my arm down, squeezing my throat harder. My throat croaked as I desperately tried to breathe, and then I realized he stupidly forgot to apprehend the arm that had a weapon. With the strength of one arm, I swung the axe behind me. He shrieked in agony as he released me from his grip. I fell to my knees, coughing up saliva as my throat opened up, trying to take in deep breaths. I wiped spit off of my lips, lifting myself off the ground. He stumbled into the wall, the axe stuck in his face. I rushed him, ripping the axe out of his face. I earned more screams from him as blood squirted onto my face, a deep gash running across his forehead. Taking away his chance to escape again, I flipped the axe around to the other blade and swung at one end of his stomach. He let out groans of pain as he gripped his gut, blood soaking through his clothes. I gripped the handle tighter, baring my teeth as I tore the blade across his stomach, then retracting it as I hit the other end. Blood poured out of his body like a waterfall as he fell to his knees. Organs began to slip out of the deep laceration, his skin painted red as he desperately tried to shove them back in with weak hands. I stood over him, my chest lifting as I breathed. He looked at me as I raised the axe, his dark pupils shrieking. I roared as I swung it down onto his head. The blade sliced through his head like a wooden log, splitting it into two as it reached his mouth. I yanked the axe out, blood shooting onto my shirt. The two halves of his axe wobbled around as he fell over, his exposed organs hitting the ground with a wet slap. I watched as his corpse transformed like the nurse, his hair decayed away and his skin faded to gray. I kneeled down, observing his corpse. "Are you some kind of demon? Or monster?" I questioned aloud, as if he'd answer. I stood up, sucking air through my teeth as I wiped blood off my cheek, the cut stinging. I looked down at my arm, blood dripping onto the floor from the cut. I reached for the corpse's clothes, tearing off a strand of his thin white coat. I wrapped it around my arm as a makeshift bandage, blood quickly soaking through. I searched down the hall for another staircase, my eyebrows raised as one caught my eye. I ran over, grabbing the knob excitedly, and my face fell as I realized it was locked as well. "Oh, fucking hell!" I exclaimed in frustration, slamming my fist against the window of the door. I aimlessly walked around, absolutely stumped. All the staircases were locked. It was as if they didn't want anybody descending any further. Are they hiding something? What's the motive? Left with nothing else, I decided to try the elevator again. The doors were still open, so I stepped back in and pressed the first floor button again. Nothing happened. I pressed it again and again and again. I was about to break it. "Come on, fucking work," I exclaimed, pounding the button with my fist. Suddenly, the speakers let out a small ding. My head perked up, noticing the doors slowly closing. I stepped back, a satisfied smile on my face. The elevator jolted down a bit, but stayed stuck. I looked down, my blood beginning to boil. Suddenly, I lost my balance as the elevator began to drop. I stumbled to the wall, holding the metal bar as the elevator screeched. Everything shook as I descended at full speed, until it crashed at the bottom floor. I groaned as I fell to the ground. I looked up at the floor number, but the light had broken. It wasn't hard to guess that I had hit the basement.